Good evening and welcome to another episode of Kink Candid. You just have Shay for the moment. Jay may be joining me. I'm not totally sure yet. We will wait and see. If not, I have a topic I would like to discuss. I do know it's been a while since we got anything up for you guys. Quarantine has been a little crazy for everybody, I'm sure, and we are no exception. But I do have some things kind of bouncing around in my head a little bit, so we're going to have a discussion about the topic of assumptions tonight. And we've touched on this topic a bit here and there in the show because it does come up in the realm of other things that we've had. But I want to talk specifically about assumptions tonight. There are a lot of assumptions that kind of go into the world of kink. And we're certainly not unique in this way. People have assumptions all over the place. And they're often a problem, and they're a problem for many groups. And we're by no means unique in that regard. But it is something that does come up in this world. And that's what I kind of want to get talking about a little bit is that topic. And I'll touch on a number of different ones, and as we work through our way through this discussion, and we'll talk about, why these assumptions might exist and why they're a problem. Because that's really a bigger thing, is why is it a problem? So first, let's talk a little bit about some of the assumptions I see floating around about dominance as a whole. One is that there is some one true way to be a dom, to be dominant in some fashion. And tied in with that is the assumption that because there's one way of being dominant, there are somehow cues that one can look at that tell you that someone is, in fact, dominant in some way. And that's a problem. And it's a problem because, one, it delineates the idea that there's wrong ways to do it. And there just isn't. And so that's the first problem, is that it sort of suggests that this is the right way and that, therefore, would be the wrong way. And as long as it's consensual and everyone's enjoying it, there really is no wrong way to do this. It's not a binary equation. It's not black and white in that way. And so that's the first problem. And secondly, if one gets into this idea that there's one way to do it and one way to look or behave in some way that makes one dominant, then it leads to false assumptions about people. That this or that person doesn't exhibit this or that characteristic and therefore isn't a dom or can't be a dom. And that's just silly, honestly. It really is. And so it's something that I sort of want to put out there very, very quickly into this equation. The other concerns specifically female dominance. Now, this is a topic we don't touch on a lot here, just because we don't have a female dominant hosting with us. It's not something that it's not a perspective that we have a lot of understanding of here, and we freely admit that. But I do know enough over the years to know that some of these assumptions I see, particularly about female dominance, are just plain wrong. This idea that female dominance must be a certain body type. Apparently tall seems to be popular in this assumption. I don't know where that came from, but I can assure you that someone's height has absolutely zero bearing on whether they are dominant or submissive, like at all, ever. That one can tell whether a female is dominant or not based on her personality in the outside world, which, again, just makes zero sense. Zero. Just like with our male dominance, you really cannot tell just because someone is assertive or self-confident out in the world as a whole doesn't tell me anything. They may be completely vanilla, They may be very dominant in their personal life, or they may be fully submissive in their personal life. It really, there's just no way to tell based on that. The other one that I see a lot about female submissive, or female dominance rather, is that, from male submissives mostly, is that female dominants are inherently geared toward and enjoy certain very specific kinks in and of themselves, that a female dominant must be into chastity, must be into orgasm denial, or must be into humiliation, in particular the small penis humiliation, which is a bit much. And the vast majority of people are not even, I don't think, familiar with that, really. It's a niche sort of kink. And there's certainly no reason to assume that just because a woman is dominant in the bedroom or in her personal life means that she's necessarily into those things. She might be, but she very well might not be. From the submissive side, I get that all male submissives must be into sissy or sissification play, which again is a perfectly valid kink that someone can be into, but it is by no means a guarantee. A male who likes to be submissive in the bedroom or in his personal life doesn't necessarily want to cross-dress. He doesn't necessarily want to be treated as a sissy. It's not necessarily something that he's into, and assuming that would be foolish. For female submissives, it's a couple of things. And all of these assumptions about that we've talked about so far when it comes to female dominance, again, it sort of negates the idea that a female dominant can be truly a valid and accepted female dominant without being into these things. And that's really very unfair. And it feeds into a lot of self-doubt about themselves, I think, because they start to wonder, am I really, because I don't like this thing, but everyone says I'm supposed to like that thing? Well, you're not supposed to like anything. And then we get into, your male submissives. Again, it's a validation sort of thing, this idea that I'm not into chastity or cross-dressing, therefore am I really a truly submissive male? Well, of course you are, if that's who you are. And not being into those things doesn't necessarily mean that that's a thing that you want. Female submissives often get the idea that we are inherently damaged in some way, in a way that I don't necessarily see with male submissives. We get treated like we must have, daddy issues or some deep emotional trauma that, and many of us do have emotional trauma, just like many humans have emotional trauma, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all submissives do. And it leads to assumptions about us that are really unhealthy. If you believe that we are all inherently traumatized, damaged women, then there's the concern that, maybe we aren't healthy, maybe we don't know really what we want. None of these are healthy attitudes to have about a submissive, and so it's damaging in that way too. And so I worry, sometimes about that. And again, much like with dominance and male submissives, we female submissives get the same kind of nonsense about how we must be into this particular thing. And there's an assumption sometimes amongst dominants, in particular, that I met a submissive who was into X thing, be that orgasm denial or orgasm control or any other various kink that they happen to be into. Therefore, this is something that submissives want. And where I see this manifest a lot is these sort of blanket questions. Do submissives like blah? Do dominants like blah? And this is where those assumptions become particularly dangerous, because it leads to this idea that we are this sort of hive mind monolith that if I am submissive, I must like X thing. And that's really quite unhealthy. Dropping back to dominance for a moment, I recently was privy to a discussion online about why it is that some doms really don't like the brat dynamic. And I've spoken about this because it's a personal pet peeve of mine. The biggest pet peeve I have with it is that brats and brat tamers have a tendency to assume that their dynamic is somehow more real or more valid or more exciting than those of us who don't engage in that particular dynamic. I have quite personally been told point blank that my submission means less because I'm not a brat, or it's not as interesting, it's more boring because I'm not a brat. And so I have a personal sort of pet peeve about that particular assumption, and that is an assumption in and of itself. I promise you, just because I'm not a brat doesn't make my dynamic or my submission boring. Promise, really. But these questions sort of come up, and there's a lot of, these sort of hive mind monolith questions. Do doms like blah? Do subs like blah? And that's inherently, I think, unhealthy. We all have our own likes. We're all individual human beings. And so it's a common problem to sort of see this idea that if you just ask a group of random strangers if submissives like X thing, then you'll know and be able to go forward with the knowledge that all subs somehow like this thing. And that's going to lead to issues when you run into a sub who doesn't like that particular thing. And it's going to be very confusing and very upsetting because now you suddenly have this idea in your head that subs like X thing, subs like it when I do blah, and then when you run into one who doesn't, it's going to lead to confusion and frustration. And that's something I generally try to avoid when it comes to all things lifestyle. I don't want anyone to be confused or frustrated. That's sort of why I do what I do here at the show, why we do what we do. And so that's the real danger about those assumptions, is that ongoing sort of confusion and frustration because you run into people that don't fit into this hive mind monolith idea that you've sort of built up in your head, that there's one way that submissives and dominants behave, and doms like these things and subs like these things, and that just isn't true. We as 24/7 couples get a whole other set of assumptions. There is the assumption, as we talked about on the show openly, about the idea that people seem to think that you must have or need time out of dynamics to be healthy. That's an assumption in and of itself. And that's particularly dangerous. If that is something that you need in your dynamic, then by all means, that is absolutely the way you should do it. However, assuming that this is an absolutely necessary thing for everyone is where it becomes dangerous, because then there is a tendency to assume that when you run into someone like me who tells you, we don't have an out-of-dynamics time, we don't have that doesn't exist in our dynamic, then there is a tendency to leap to the assumption that this must be horribly abusive and unhealthy, and it isn't. And the only reason that you see it that way is because you've been told that this is a necessary thing in 24/7. So it's particularly damaging. I was recently privy to a conversation on Reddit that revolved around how often did 24/7 couples engage in consensual non-consent play. And I was very confused because this was, again, based on the assumption that as a 24/7 couple, this must be a thing that you do. And it isn't for me. That's not a form of play that we engage in. And so I was very confused as to why the question was even being asked specifically. And it was rooted in this assumption. 24/7 means this must happen. Well, no, it really doesn't, actually. People I've recently encountered is that there's this assumption that those of us who are 24/7 must be engaging in overtly kinky activities at all times. that we don't, and so this is the root of the questions about, well, how can you be 24/7 if you have kids? How can you be 24/7 if you have this job or that job or whatever? And it's all rooted in this assumption that all things that we do in a 24/7 dynamic are overtly sexualized and overtly kinky. And I can assure you, having lived it for a number of years now, that it absolutely could not be further from the truth. The vast majority of our life does not revolve around overtly kinky acts. It just doesn't. We enjoy them as much as the next couple, don't get me wrong, but the vast majority of our life is centered around very normal things that any other couple or family would deal with. We go to the grocery store, we clean the house, we have various, family activities that we engage in. We go outdoors, we do all sorts of things that look very similar to literally any other household anywhere in the world. And it doesn't look overtly kinky. I'm not in chains all the time. I'm not restrained all the time. It just isn't like that. But there's this common assumption, and it again leads to fears in people that really don't need to exist. And I see this in the form of questions about, well, my dominant wants to explore a 24/7 dynamic, and I'm really interested in it, but I'm afraid because we have kids or want to have kids. I promise you, if you were not laboring under the assumption of what 24/7 means, you wouldn't have that fear, because the two things are not incongruous or incompatible in any way. And so again, you see the danger of these sorts of assumptions. Assuming that anyone who's not a brat must be boring is an assumption. Assuming that all doms do or should like brats because they want the challenge is another assumption that I see a lot, and it's particularly damaging because I've been doing this a long time, and I'm not likely to be impacted by people assuming that my dynamic is boring or what have you. I'm not overly worried about such things. It doesn't bother me in the slightest. But for newer people, I can see where it would be damaging. To the new submissive who's out there trying to kind of find her or his place in this world, being told doms like a challenge, doms want this, doms want that, then they start beginning to wonder, is this what I need to be a part of this world? And you don't. If you want to be that kind of submissive, then by all means go for it and find a dom that's compatible with. But if you are not that kind of submissive, it's so damaging to think that you have to be. And it's dangerous. It really is. It's damaging to people's psyche. And I hate to see it. Another personal pet peeve of mine is the aftercare assumption. I saw it again today. The statement that aftercare is absolutely necessary and non-negotiable and very necessary unequivocally for all parties at all times. It is not. I'm just going to point that out. I'm just going to say that point blank. It is not. And it leads to people feeling as though they're doing it wrong. If you are a submissive like me, who really doesn't need aftercare in the way that most people think of it, because I don't. Aftercare has reached sort of this epic proportions, mythical status in the community as a whole, and there's a very clear line of what delineates appropriate aftercare, and it is apparently supposed to include, what was I told recently? Oh yes, I was told that aftercare needed to have, every dom needed to have an aftercare kit which contained a warm blanket, a sugary snack such as a lollipop, and a cuddly toy, because these were absolutely necessary things for every single person. I do not want any of these things. If you come at me with a warm blanket after we are done playing, I'm going to be very annoyed because I'm usually quite hot and I want to lay in front of the fan and cool off. So please keep your warm blanket and miss me with that. Secondly, I don't necessarily want sugar. I might want sugar, but I don't necessarily want sugar. And if I want sugar, I'm more than capable of saying that I want sugar and obtaining sugar from the various supplies of sugar that exist in my house. The cuddly toy thing is really baffling to me because while I love cuddly toys, I don't necessarily want them after playtime. That's not inherently necessary for me. But aftercare is supposed to apparently include both drinks and food. Usually blankets get mentioned. A lot of emotional support is frequently mentioned. And, the check-ins, that you're supposed to be checking in with them for several days after a play session to make sure that they are okay and not dropping. Sub-drop and what it is and what it is not is a topic for another time. But the idea that everyone needs aftercare in this particular way is particularly damaging because, again, for submissives, it leads to this idea that somehow there's something wrong with them or they're doing it wrong because they don't necessarily need those things. Like I said, I don't. My emotional needs are met by my relationship. Typically after any kind of play session, what I want is something to drink, and I want to lay on my bed in front of my fan and cool off. Typically he's there next to me, also doing the same thing, drinking water and cooling off. As far as, emotional such, typically the most that goes to, in our case, is to tell each other that we are awesome. That is a running thing that we do. Makes us both feel good. But outside of that, I really don't need anything. I'm good. I promise. And if I were younger or newer or less self-assured about myself as a submissive, I would be very concerned that there was something wrong with me or that I was doing it wrong because I don't actually need these things. And everyone keeps telling me I'm supposed to need them, and I really don't. It also leads to dominance thinking that it is okay to say things like, and I've actually seen this said, so this is again another example of sort of the danger in this, is things like, you should give them aftercare and insist on aftercare even if they say they don't need it or don't want it, because it's necessary. This is an incredibly dangerous tactic to take, and this is the real problem with that particular assumption. The assumption is all subs need aftercare. This leads to, even if she says they say they don't need aftercare, you as the dominant should insist on giving it to them. This is dangerous. And I want to be very clear to all of our listeners out there. If someone says they do not want something, even if that thing is aftercare, you absolutely need to respect that. Just as if you wanted to engage in a specific kink activity and your submissive partner said, no, thank you, I don't want to engage in that particular activity, you would be expected to respect that. The same is true here. You want to engage in an aftercare routine, your submissive partner says, no, thank you, I'm good. Do not push that issue. Do not. This is something that's particularly dangerous because it leads to what could be considered to be a railroading of someone else's consent, which we should never, ever, ever do, ever. And so this is, again, where that becomes very dangerous. The other one that comes up a lot is the idea that there is some sort of ladder or hierarchy that one is supposed to follow, that one is supposed to engage in non-committed play sessions, then one is supposed to engage in a committed dom-sub relationship, then one progresses to a master-slave relationship, and then one progresses into 24/7 or TPE relationships. This is not a helpful attitude to take. It just isn't. And I cannot tell you how many times I have seen someone say that they are X number of years old, usually in their early 20s, and they are in a 24/7 dynamic, and they're having a question about blah, some specific thing. And instead of answering the question about the specific thing that they're asking a question about, the comments are filled with people going, oh my gosh, you're way too young. You haven't been doing this long enough. There's no way you should be in a 24/7 dynamic. And no, stop. No, just no. I entered into a 24/7 dynamic when I was 19 years old. And I do not regret it for 1 second. That was who I was and who I am, and it's who I still am. And there was no reason, start as you mean to go on. If what you want is 24/7 master and slave, then that's what you should be starting your negotiations and discussions based in. There's no reason to negotiate your relationship as a non-24/7 dynamic and then later try to progress it into 24/7 if you always knew you wanted to be 24/7. If you weren't sure that's what you wanted, then fine, that makes total sense that you would, maybe you didn't realize that at the time. Maybe you only came to that realization later, and that's absolutely valid. But if you knew that you wanted a 24/7 dynamic, why would you start as something else? It makes no sense. And now this poor young submissive is A, not getting an answer to the question they have, and B, being told essentially you're doing it wrong. And this all based on this assumption that there is some sort of progression and ladder and path that one has to walk down before one can be 24/7. It's a bit ridiculous, honestly. And I don't want to see people coming to feel like they're wrong for it. And there's all these assumptions. And if you're into any form of sort of DDLG play, I myself, I do identify as a middle. So I don't have a childlike regression state. I do have sort of a teenager state. But that if one is into those things, that several things must be true. That one must have daddy issues. I do not. That one must be somehow broken or damaged in some way. I am, but that really has nothing to do with it. That one is into incest, again, not. Or that these submissives are inherently bratty. And again, no, just no. And all of this to say that I think the bigger concern really is the fact that it's not about people like me. That's not where my concern is. Like I said, I've been doing this a really long time. I am utterly confident in who and what I am and my role in the lifestyle. I mean, I married my dominant. Everything's working out just fine for me. I worry about these assumptions, though, because I see younger doms, newer doms, younger subs, newer subs, seeing these assumptions and getting these things told to them early on in their exploration of the lifestyle, and it's not helping them. It's making their path much harder than it needs to be. Doms are not a monolith. They're not a hive mind, male or female. There's no one way that a dom looks or behaves. There's no one set of things that a dom likes or doesn't like. Same thing is true for subs. We are not a hive mind monolith either. There's no one way that we look or behave outside in the real world, so to speak. And there's no one set of list of things that I can say, if you are a sub, you do like X, Y, and Z and do not like A, B, and C. This is just not a thing I can say any more than I could say about the dominance, because it's not true in either case. And not all 24/7 relationships look the same. As we've talked openly on the show, Jay's relationship with his wife and my relationship with my husband, both 24/7, different in a number of ways. Their dynamic works for them. Our dynamic works for us. Both are considered 24/7, but we don't exactly look the same. There are other 24/7 couples who do engage in, for example, consensual non-consent. I do not, but they do, and both are valid. And no, not all of us need aftercare, at least not in the way that people think it is. I was asked that recently online about whether a how does aftercare work in 24/7 relationships? And I was like, well, I'll be honest with you. We don't engage in aftercare in the way that most people seem to think of it. I don't. He will attend to any physical needs, lotion after fire play, things like that. And we'll get water. Usually I get him water if needs be. And we kind of chill on the bed and cool off and generally reiterate that we are in fact awesome. And then we go on with our lives. I don't need an extended debriefing session. I don't need a bunch of emotional reassurance that, he does in fact like me and care about me because we're married. Obviously he likes me. And obviously I like him. And my emotional need for you're beautiful or wonderful, or his emotional need for you're awesome and amazing, those sorts of needs are not typically met in the aftercare sense. They are met with our day-to-day relationship. And we don't do the check-in thing because that would be silly. We live together. If there's a problem, we'll figure it out. And all of it sort of comes back around to just say that any of these assumptions feed back into this idea that there's one true way to do this. One way to be a dom, one way to be a sub, one way to be 24/7. And all of that is inherently bad, I think, for especially newer people in the lifestyle because they're getting the wrong idea. And it leads to people saying things like, I know this guy and he's soft-spoken and super polite and non-confrontational and he's kind of short, so therefore he must be a sub. No. He might be, but there's no way, none of what you have said there tells me that this person is submissive. At all. And this person is setting themselves up for a major disappointment if they assume that this person is submissive and then find out that, no, just kidding. Maybe he's a dom. Maybe he's completely vanilla. And that's not healthy. Or, as I said, the other danger is things like telling people that all subs need aftercare leads to things like, well, if they say they don't need aftercare, you should insist on it. You absolutely should not. Absolutely should not. Ever. Listen to your partners on this. It also leads to the assumption that because we've been told that all subs need aftercare, it's non-negotiable, it's absolutely critical and vital in every single situation. It leads to two things. One, this idea that if a dom doesn't do aftercare in the way that it's being told to, which includes the, several days after of check-ins, if they don't, for example, do those check-ins, then they must be a terrible, horrible dom, and that's not fair. You've set a submissive up to be disappointed and a dom up to be the fall guy, and none of that is good. It also leads to this idea that if you aren't doing it this way, then you're doing it wrong. Oh, you mean your dom didn't get you a blanket and a cuddly toy? Terrible, terrible, fake dom, bad dom. I'm like, except that no. The only aftercare that is non-negotiable is the aftercare that has already been negotiated. It also leads to the sort of almost predatory people assuming that, well, he said he was a dom, so he's supposed to do X, Y, Z, and now I'm going to bash him because he didn't do X, Y, and Z because that's what I think a dom is supposed to do. Or they said they were a sub, but they didn't immediately do A, B, and C, and therefore I'm going to trash them and say that they're a bad sub because that's what subs are supposed to do, right? Yeah, all of this is bad. And I'm not entirely sure why we got the idea somehow that these assumptions, which would be invalid and stated as such, and you would be told in any other community that making these sorts of assumptions about people based on minimal information at best was unfair and unhealthy, and you should definitely stop doing that. I'm not sure why we reached the point that within the kink lifestyle that everyone, it's totally acceptable to make those assumptions. As a wrap-up, please do not assume that because a man is, or a woman, is tall or self-confident that makes them inherently a dom. It does not. They might be, they might not be. Please do not assume that because someone is soft-spoken or polite or short or non-confrontational that must inherently mean they are submissive. It does not. They might be, they might not be. Please do not assume that non-brats are boring or that all doms like a challenge from their submissive. Please do not necessarily. Please also do not assume on that side note, please also do not assume that if a dom says that they don't like brats and that is not a dynamic they are interested in, please also do not assume that means any one of three things: that they are unable to handle a brat, that they are weak as a dominant, or that they are just don't understand brats. This is not necessarily true. My dominant, for example, absolutely is capable of handling a brat. He is decidedly not weak as a dominant, and he absolutely understands them. He just doesn't choose to do it. Please do not assume that all 24/7 couples are overtly kinky all the time. We are not. I promise. Please do not assume that we engage in CNC play. We do not. And please, for the love of all that is holy, please stop assuming that everyone needs aftercare and that even those that do need aftercare must inherently need it in the same way. Stop telling people all subs require aftercare. We do not. I do not. All aftercare must follow this set protocol. No. Just no. Assumptions are inherently bad and damaging for our community, and consider this my attempt to put sort of a stop to that problem, because it's not helping anybody. It leads to people questioning themselves, their roles, their relationships, and it may be running newer people out of the lifestyle because they think they're doing it wrong. And I don't think any of us want that. Tune in for our next episode. We are going to talk about kink in media, finally. I know we've been promoting that for a while. We haven't gotten to it yet, but that's going to be a topic that we're going to touch on. Books, movies, TV, good and bad, the good, the bad, the ugly. Kink as it's portrayed in media, who gets it right, who gets it wrong. Until then, stay safe out there. Please stay home if you're under quarantine, which almost everyone is at this point. Stay home, stay safe, and stay kinky.